That's not to say the previous years were easy, far from it. There were long stretches of hopelessness and desperation, wishing to go back in time somehow, some way, change what I'd done, but wishing did nothing, and the only reality was my 8x11 cell, and the moments I spent out of it. Quickly I learned that I had to stop thinking about the outside world, even when it entered my new one. The first time my wife and kids came to visit me, I had a black eye and broken nose from talking to the wrong person in the lunch line. After that, only my wife came to visit. She stuck with her weekly trips until I was transferred out of state to Pickaway County Pen to share out my sentence. The visits became phone calls, which became letters, which became silence. It was just too difficult for all of us. I can't imagine what it was like for them to see a loved one in a place like that. It was so hard for me to see them come in. They seemed perfect and innocent, a shimmer of momentary light in my new dark world. And it was all so senseless. What I'd done hadn't even been intentional. It was an accident, a slip of the mind, a momentary break from my daily duties. But it resulted in 13 deaths, an entire family Christmas dinner party, 2 grandparents, 4 couples, and 7 grandchildren, all gone. And it was all because their landlord, me, hadn't made the appropriate changes to their furnace, and it spewed out carbon monoxide. As the family gathered, the new CO2 detectors hadn't been installed yet. All 13 were dead at the dinner table before the meal cooled. We were just getting home from our own family dinner when I saw the EMS vehicles outside. I knew right away what happened, as did investigators. I was taken into custody soon after, and a case was levied against me as new information came out about several arguments I'd had with the tenants. They pushed for intent, but it was weak and fell apart. But still, I was sentenced to 30 years through varying convictions regarding gross negligence resulting in the deaths of those 13 people. One of their relatives came to visit me once. She spat on the glass partition and told me she hoped I went to hell. The adjustment from real life to prison life was hard, but I found it built up my discipline. Every aspect of my life was regimented into sections of the day, and because of my condition, I was granted certain privileges and accesses I wouldn't normally have. My condition was a calcified brain tumor that I've had since I was a child. My mother had the same one. In fact, she developed it when she was pregnant with me. It was located in a place in the brain, the same as mine, where it couldn't be operated on. Because she was pregnant with me, most treatment options were out for my mom. The doctors gave her 3 months to live. At the time, I was 4 months from being born, so the whole thing turned into a grand supportive push from everyone around her to keep my mother alive long enough to give birth to me, or long enough that even if I was premature, I'd be developed enough to live a normal life. 3 months passed. My mom was still going. Then I was born, a healthy baby boy, and all of a sudden, the brain tumor had calcified and was no longer an issue, the same as mine. Only I didn't get mine in my 30s, like my mother did. Mine developed when I was 10. It came on fast. All of a sudden I was getting terrible migraines, and my vision would go blurry. I hid it from my parents for as long as I could because I knew the story of my birth, and that it would be upsetting to my mother. What happened was worse. She found me bleeding from my ears in the backyard. I was rushed to the hospital and found to have the same tumor, only mine was more advanced and aggressive. The doctors gave me a month. My parents were devastated. I was in shock. The next few weeks were filled with tests and arrangements. Most of it was a blur, but the afternoon I remember most was when my parents took me to the mall and told me I could go into any clothing store and pick out any suit or outfit I wanted. I knew something was up because we were poor, and this never happened in our family. And as I was trying on clothes, my parents were crying. It didn't dawn on me until years later that they took me there to pick out what I'd be buried in, but I never brought it up with them. I never needed to. The month passed, and then another one did, and another. My tumor had shrunk and calcified. It was still there, like my mother's, but was unreachable, and from what the doctors said, was dead and not dangerous. It was a miracle, just like my mom's. Of course, I still had migraines from time to time, but it beats dying at 10 years old. And as I said, it helped separate me from typical prison life. Working in the library meant I got access to it at most times of the day, so that's where I went. I read a lot the first few years. I took classes and workshops. I even discovered a secret about the library. It had a hidden room. It wasn't really a room, so much as half a cell that had been closed off with a steel sheet behind a large bookshelf. A steel sheet had come loose and allowed entry, but could be slid back to make it invisible again. Of course, the half cell was enclosed by cement. There was no escaping through it, but it was a place you could hide if you needed to, and I added some small makeshift blocks to the inside in case I ever needed it. The only person I ever told about the secret hideout was a small, defenseless man named Jackson who'd gotten a job in the library. He was doing a 15-year stint for wire and mail fraud amongst a few others, and had already been eaten up a few times by the more unwelcoming inmates. Jackson and I became good friends, and even though my parole had been granted and I was gonna be out in a few months, I was gonna miss him and our chats. Jackson was also the first and only person I told about the new inmate. I watched the transport bus from the window of the library and saw the 2x2 group of 16 inmates marched out and entered into their new caged home. He was in the last group of 2, and the guy beside him looked terrified. The new prisoner was named Levo. He was black with a thick, dark afro jutting out in short, strange dreads. Levo was a Haitian immigrant with a harsh, severe, and bony face. Whispers about him having ties to voodoo black magic circulated through the yard, and it was easy to see why. Wherever Levo went in the prison, people kept their distance. It was almost like he emitted some strange, unseen, but heavily felt radiation that caused inmates to scatter as Levo got closer. I watched it happen from the library window as Levo would move through the yard slowly, and groups of people, whoever they were, would get up and casually scatter to other ends of the yard. In the caf, the same thing happened at tables at meal times, and in the showers too. Not that I ever had a run-in. About a week into Levo's arrival, inmates and cells were switched around after an internal drug bust, and Levo's previously single room became a double. The man who moved into Levo's cell was a gangbanger named Stacks. Stacks was a loudmouth and went off at anyone who would listen. But the morning after he moved into Levo's cell, Stacks was a different person. He was quiet, still, and he looked terrified. Stacks walked into the caf at breakfast and stopped in the middle of the line. He tipped his head down and stared at the ground in front of his feet. He didn't budge until breakfast was over. Then he left and went outside. In the yard, Stacks did the same thing. He stared down, just ahead of his feet, until our time outside was almost up. But before it was, one of Stacks' boys, a llama, finally came up to him and tried to get his attention. Stacks finally turned his eyes away from the ground and looked up, matching a llama's. Stacks' eyes went wide. He looked terrified. The llama backed away, and the alarm buzzed for us to go inside. Stacks' eyes were locked on the llama now. I didn't see either of them until the next day, and they were both dead when I did. Stacks had found a small partition of metal, bent it multiple times, and sharpened an edge into a shiv. He'd stabbed a llama to death with it, poked out his eyes, then slit his own throat. It was an open and shut case to anyone not watching, but I was watching, and I continued to track Levo as he'd get closer and closer to people at lunch, in the yard, and in the halls. 2 more inmates died, this time in the showers. The same details as Stacks, and a llama, metal shiv, dozens of stab wounds, eyes poked out, and the suicidal throat slash to cap it. Word was spreading through the yard that a huge inmate named Lil Mo put out a hit on Levo. Lil Mo was the head of one of the black gangs and had resources. He also had ties to the kitchen, so his first thought was to poison Levo. The problem was, no one ever saw Levo eat, so Lil Mo had to come up with a new plan. Lil Mo increased the money reward he was offering, but no one was taking the job. 2 more inmates died. Metal shiv, stab wounds, poked out eyes, slashed throat suicide, and both of the victims were members of Lil Mo's gang. The reward was doubled. A group of 3 thugs that basically controlled the bench press in the workout yard 24/7 agreed to take on the job. Lil Mo got them actual weapons, knives, and solid metal pipes. He didn't care if the murder didn't look like an accident. The longer Levo was alive, the less Lil Mo controlled the yard. A manufactured fight between two of Lil Mo's men caused a distraction for the guards. While the three thugs followed Leval out of the lunchroom, they supposedly attacked Leval in the hallway, but no one knows what happened, only what happened next. When all the inmates were allowed outside that afternoon, the three thugs were standing in the middle of the yard, nowhere near the bench press station, and they were staring blankly at the ground. No one could get their attention. The three men only moved when the alarm buzzed for us to go back inside, and when we did, there was Leval, waiting in the darkness of his cell. He had been untouched. That night, there were screams through the cells. The prison went into a lockdown for 24 hours. By the time it was reopened, news had traveled to every inmate about what had happened. The three thugs had gone into their cells that night, killed their bunkmates with shivs, and then killed themselves. 6 deaths in one night. It was a prison record. None of the inmates knew what to do. I was lucky and got to spend most of my time away from them in the library, but I watched from the windows as they all tried to avoid Leval, and for the most part, they did. Word got out that Leval was being transferred to another prison. Not a tear was shed from anyone, but it wasn't happening until the end of the month, which was 3 weeks away, and in the second, Leval caught me watching him. I was in the library as usual, standing by the window and watching the events of the exercise yard. I was trying to find Leval, but couldn't spot him. Then I did. Leval was standing near the basketball court. His eyes were fixed on me in the window. I actually felt colder when I saw him. I was so fixed on his eyes I didn't realize Leval had started walking to the entrance doors to the prison. He disappeared inside, and I lost sight of him. For some reason, I knew he was on his way up to me. I turned to move to the exit and came face to face with Leval. A moment later, he was beside me. Leval was whispering into my ear, and my vision suddenly darkened. I knew I was losing consciousness, and my legs were buckling. I fell back against the carpeted floor of the library, and my head hit something familiar. It was the pillow on my bunk. My vision flooded back, and I was no longer in the library. I was laying in my bed back in my cell, but it was night now. The prison was freezing. I could see my own breath. My jail door was open, so I got up and looked out to the small courtyard, an opposing wall of cells facing mine. There was a strange light coming from somewhere below us that pulsed a dark red, filling the compound for a moment before it plunged us back into darkness. What I could see was that the other cells were all closed, and they appeared to be empty. A loud screech came from the bottom left corner of the wall of cells facing mine. I knew right away whose cell it was coming from. My eyes instinctively moved to the sound. It was Leval's cell, and it was open. I knew Leval was standing in his cell, just out of sight. Then his footsteps carried his strange and wiry frame in the pulsing red light. He was staring up at me. His eyes locked onto mine again. A new series of screeches pierced out from all over the prison. All the cell doors were now sliding open. In the depths of the dark cells, I could see the same figures waiting to step out. Dozens of twin Levals stepped out of the open cell doors from everywhere. The ones facing me, and the ones on my side, and every single Leval was staring directly at me. They all had white paint and smeared streaks vertically down their faces like some war mask. In an instant, they all moved at the exact same time, darting towards me. I jumped back into my cell, grabbing a hold of the door, expecting it not to budge. But it did. It slid shut, and I held it there. Arms reached in, grabbing me and squeezing my throat. Dozens of bodies were piled up against the bars of my cell, trying to pull the door open or tear me apart. Somehow, the door held, and they didn't get in, but Leval floated through the bars and into my cell. He hovered over me, the skin on his face melting away and dripping down onto mine. Large flashes of white light filled my cell in quick, repeated strobes. Then I was in one of the prison hospital rooms. I was in a bed with tubes and monitors attached to me. A nurse told me I'd been found in the library. I'd fallen and cracked my head, suffering a heavy concussion. I'd been out for 2 days. I asked about Leval, but they said it had just been me in the library. No sign of anyone else. Somehow, whatever Leval did to the other prisoners didn't work on me. The only thing I could think of was the calcified tumor in my brain. Could it possibly have saved my life? Suddenly, I was feeling grateful for what was previously a curse. I was released back to Gen Pop 2 days later and immediately wished I was still in the infirmary. Things had gotten scary. VValters' transfer was coming up, and it looked like he had been busy while I was out. My first day back, I was late going out to the yard in the morning. I wished I hadn't gone at all. More than half of the inmates outside were in the statue stance, unmoving, unwavering. They were unresponsive to the guards, even when the guards took it a step further and pepper sprayed, tasered, and billy clubbed them. The inmates didn't move. They all stood their grounds. Only now, they weren't looking down. They were looking at me, and Levo was amongst them. The alarm buzzed for the end of the outside break. Every inmate staring at me bolted for me in sync. There were frightening snarls on their faces, and they looked overcome with rage like they wanted to tear me apart. I wasn't far from the doors, and got inside just as the riot team was on its way out. They'd seen the large group of inmates doing the statue pose in the yard, and the team was on the ready to make a move. I burst through the line of riot shields, as they didn't seem to care about me. I ran as fast as I could, knowing there was only one place I might be safe. I heard the doors behind me burst open, followed by screams and yells from the crowd of possessed inmates. I knew the riot team would only hold for so long. I just needed to get to the library. I made my way down the few hallways it took to get there, and found it empty. I jammed a chair against the door handle and ran to the back of the library. When I got to the back wall, I shifted the bookshelf forward at the far end and slid behind it into the opening. I pulled the metal sheet aside and slid in. I pulled the metal sheet back and fastened it to 3 makeshift locks I'd built over the years. Outside, I heard the library door burst open, and the yells of insane inmates screaming for my blood filled the room. I built the locks, so I knew they were pretty strong, but were they strong enough to keep out the hordes of inmates pouring into the library? I knew they were going to find the cubby because I saw Jackson and the horde of inmates chasing me. He knew this was here, and whatever he knew, I imagined Levo knew. Sure enough, I heard the bookshelf in front of my hiding place crash down. Hands pounded against the metal sheet. The locks I made rattled in their hinges. My voice was called out, shrilly, from a strangely disturbed sounding Jackson. The mob kept banging on the metal sheet, trying to break through or shift it enough to get inside. But it stuck, and they didn't get in. I'm not sure how much time passed, but eventually the banging stopped, and so did the screaming. I stayed in the cubby overnight, just in case. The next morning, I heard cleanup crews clearing rooms. I unlocked the latches and slid the metal sheet aside. The room was filled with the bodies of inmates. Orange jumpsuits stained red, stab wounds and throat slits, eyes punctured and hollowed out. The cleaning crew entered and stared at me like I was levitating. They hadn't expected to find any survivors, but there I stood, not a drop of blood or a scratch on me. I was led back to my cell, where I waited to be told where to go or what to do. My sentence was basically done, and the authorities gave the green light to release me a few days early. In the days after the release, I looked into what happened at the prison. Apparently, over 200 inmates and 14 prison guards died in the riot, but the whole thing was being hushed over and claimed to be some kind of mass food poisoning. The names of the dead inmates were made public. Levo wasn't one of them. I looked into him and even hired a private investigator to find out where Levo had ended up. Turned out, he'd been transferred out of state, and by the time I'd gotten the information, there'd already been 2 deaths and 2 suicides at Levo's new prison.